Hi, everyone. My name is Monica Kretschmer, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Universal Women's Network and Women of Inspiration Awards. And this is the Woman of Inspiration podcast, where we interview women of inspiration who are leading by example and making change locally, nationally, and globally. Now, our women of inspiration are trailblazers, and they're inspiring others to dream big. Now, today with me is a very special guest. Of course, we just wrapped up our 2020 Women of Inspiration Awards. And with me today is Lori Campbell. Lori, you are our 2020 Woman of Inspiration Indigenous Leader Award recipient. So congratulations on your award this year in a very historical year. Of course, we've had so many conversations over the past 8 months during COVID about, how do we move women forward? So I'm really delighted to have you on the show today. Before we get started, I'm going to share a little bit of your bio, and then I've stumbled on a couple of the words. We were talking about that in the green room. So then I'd like to talk about that with you live because we had such a great conversation. So welcome. Lori is a Two-Spirit Cree-Metis, and there's a word, so I'd love to hear you share the actual Cree word for, your Cree-Metis, with family roots at the Montreal Lake First Nations, Treaty 6 territory. Lori is an intergenerational survivor of the Indian residential school system and a child from the 60s Scoop generation. So we are going to dive into that because that's super interesting and really part of your story and really why you're building what you're building. Over the span of 25 years, and this is an incredible story, Lori created not only her birth mom, but all 6 of her living siblings who were scattered across several provinces. Like, I get goosebumps even thinking about that, Lori. So I think what I'd really love to do is start there and then start into your career and what led you to this place right now as a social justice advocate and really just using your voice for good. So welcome, Lori.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Monica. And just, to start off, it is truly an honor to have been nominated for an award, first of all, and in, Indigenous leadership category, and being nominated by a student, as a primary nominator from where I work. And then to receive a, notification that I won was, I just was really surprised. And so it is a great honor. So thank you for that. Yes.
Well, you're welcome. And before we dive into that, let's talk a little bit further about, being valued and, all of this great work that you're doing. I know we talk about, every day is a new day, and you just focused on your goals and your vision. So when this notification came through, how was that received? Who, me, or were you able to step into that spotlight and say, yes, I really do deserve the recognition. I've been working really hard. So I'd love to sort of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I guess I don't, I've learned a lot as I've reconnected to my Indigenous identity, which I started very early on, and really connected a lot with our Indigenous philosophies and ways of being in the world. And so sometimes, certainly, as women, yes, but also if you think about Indigenous philosophy, it can make it really difficult for us to sort of feel like we, should be sort of shining any sort of light on ourselves and our work that we do, because for me, it's, really, I do what I do because I feel like I have the ability to do it. And therefore it becomes a responsibility, right? And I hear this and I learn this from community members and from elders in our community. For example, I have a skill set that allows me to work well in post-secondary institutions, to navigate sort of mainstream politics and advocate for things in a good way. And therefore it's my responsibility to take on that role and to do that kind of work. And so, being recognized for some of that work from community members is a really high honor. It's a really special honor for sure.
And I would just love to say, I love how you are bringing awareness to that, because I think that's a barrier for some I'm not going to say all women, but most women, and myself included, is it's not about putting the focus on you. Rather, it's shining the light on the ability to reach a larger audience. So that's why I'm super excited to be interviewing you today, because I'd really love to, number one, let's go back to Two-Spirit. We had a conversation about that in the green room, and I said, okay, so Two-Spirit versus Second Spirit, what is the difference? And then it was Cree-Metis. So Two-Spirit, Cree-Metis, but then there was two words after Two-Spirit that I couldn't even pronounce, and because they were in Cree. And I said, can you break that down for me? I'd like to try it. And so maybe you can share a little bit about what Two-Spirit is, and then actually the Cree, you know, in Cree
Yeah.
language, what that means.
Right, and you know, and it's really important. I learned very early on that it's really important. You know, our elders really want us to try and learn our languages. You know, if our Indigenous languages disappear, there's no place where we can go back. Like, there's no other territory or land, another country that we can go back to find those and to reconnect. And so, and the very fact that you know, certainly most of us don't know our language was very specific because of government policy and intention to kind of sever us from our indigeneity, right? Whether it was through the residential schools like my grandmother and many others, and other sort of the Sixties Scoop, which for myself, right, those policies of assimilation. So I feel like my Cree is pronounced poorly. And but I do know that you know, I'm encouraged to you know, to continue to do that, and to kind of you know, speak it in public. And so I identify as nēhiyaw, āpihtākosisān, which is my understanding is Cree-Metis. So my grandmother's family is from Montreal Lake First Nation in Treaty 6 territory, and my grandfather, although not a status Indian by the governments, he's definitely was an Indigenous man. But he was, you know, called himself Métis, or more Métis or Michif, I guess. And so, yeah, so I, you know, I inherit both of those. So I'm Cree-Metis. And Two-Spirit is, in our culture, you know, I've come to learn too that we're very much affiliated with our roles and responsibilities, and you know, around our identities and the things that we do. And so with colonization also came sort of the violence against people who weren't heterosexual, and so people who were queer in communities, and that impacted our communities as well. And so historically, those of us that were not heterosexual, we also had very specific roles in the community, certainly around in ceremony and spaces that we could be in, and spaces that we had a skill set to navigate. And so the term Two-Spirit is actually a relatively new term. And it was came out of a conference at a gathering in Manitoba in, I think, the 90s, I think is when it was. And where, you know, Indigenous people had gathered and were trying to come up with some sort of common term to kind of, you know, identify ourselves and sort of make a reclaiming of our identity. And to me, the term Two-Spirit, so you would be Indigenous if you're going to be Two-Spirit. You can't be not Indigenous and be Two-Spirit. But to me, there's also a strong, significant connection to your indigeneity and understanding who you are in your culture, and responsibilities that come with that. So it might be different than if I say, because I will say sometimes, well, I'm queer, I'm, you know, kind of talking about one aspect of my life, but I'm not really talking about my cultural connection and understanding. And so, so there's you know, some nuances within there, and yeah, and so it's Two-Spirit, nēhiyaw, āpihtākosisān, woman. Yeah.
Amazing. And I think thank you for clarifying that, because I was looking at it, but I didn't have the understanding, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that right now, more importantly, and I think that, you know, we can talk a little bit about that, is about, you know, bringing the awareness to certain things. And if I don't understand something, I simply will say, I don't understand. Can you help me understand? And not being embarrassed because I don't know it. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think that is how we're going to move the needle to create understanding for people, is to say, I just simply do not know what that means. Please help. And, you know, educators like yourself, you know, that must be almost music to your ears when somebody says, I don't know, can you help me?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, and I recognize that that is, you know, one of the roles that I have taken on, right? I mean, I'm very passionate about education for many reasons. And again, it's something that I seem to have a strong skill set for. And so it's a role that I take on to engage with people and to help with education and knowledge, you know, transference in our own communities. But that being said, it's not necessarily every Indigenous person who, you know, is comfortable with that and who takes that on. So it's really important for people to seek out, you know, Indigenous peoples or community members who are, you know, at the forefront of that kind of work, to seek out some of those answers and direction.
Perfect. And so I want to go back to, if you can, I mean, you talk about the 60s scoop
Mm,
generation, and also about, your journey, in the Indian residential school system, and, being an intergenerational survivor, and really, you know, finding your siblings. So I would love you to share your story about that with our listeners, because that is part of our heritage, and such, it's such a tragedy, and you've really managed to do something that not a lot of people had the ability to do. It's
mhm.
remarkable. So I'd love you to be able to share that story.
Yeah, I would say in spite of government policies that, you know, make it really difficult for us to do, I did manage to do that. And so my grandmother went to Indian residential school, and then as the residential school started to fall out of favor, or it was decided that they weren't the assimilation policy that the government wanted, right? Because the intent of the residential schools was very specifically to get the Indian out of the child, and that's, you know, on the books documented. And so its intent was to assimilate us, to remove our languages, to remove our culture, essentially, so that we would be there would be no Indigenous left, no indigeneity left. Um, Anyways, as the residential school started to fall out of favor, a new assimilation policy came out. It was called AIM. It was called Adopt Indian Métis Children. Most people don't know about it. And most people, you know, who the social workers even who were a part of the adoptions, the families that did the adoptions, this is not a blame game at all. Most people didn't know what was going on. This was coming from the government. And so there were advertisements in papers across major cities, across Canada, across Turtle Island, that were, you know, Wednesday's Child. And so what was decided was that we would take Indigenous children out of their homes and adopt them into white families. Many of us stayed in Canada, but also many went overseas, and not just to the States, but further overseas than that. And so that was another process of trying to assimilate us. But we were advertised literally in papers across Canada. And there's Indigenous families who saw their children in the newspapers with a different first name saying, oh, you know, Jill is up for adoption. She needs a family. A child is waiting. Meanwhile, what most Canadians also didn't know was that there were Indigenous families waiting for these children to come back. And so, anyways, and so from the mid 50s through to the 80s, essentially this program ran, and there was, you know, I think upwards of 20,000 people that is believed to have been adopted out because of that process. There hasn't been support for us to be able to find our families of origin. But I work in education. I'm a researcher, and I also just chalk that up to, you know, Monica, like I cross paths. I don't know how or why that was my path, but I crossed paths with some amazing mentors and leaders who, really helped me to, you know, reach goals and to do things that other people just never had opportunity to do. During the process of searching, I met and spoke to probably hundreds of other people like me, many who are not doing well, because as you can imagine, the trauma of loss, and not everybody went to good homes. And I say good kind of loosely, right? Like parents weren't taught that our identities were important, and so they weren't there to try and help us reclaim our indigeneity. And that was the guidance they were given. But I have also talked to people my age who have told me about being kept in cages, being farm laborers, having to sleep in outbuildings, you know, and a lot of that also occurred. And so it's you know, it's been a really it's another piece of a dark history of Canada. And you know, and we need to kind of reconcile that and learn about it, and so that we don't repeat it, and so that we can, you know, do better moving forward. I knew I was adopted. I was taken when I was 14 months old. And I grew up for 16 years in a family in rural Northeast Saskatchewan. And you know, I often say I grew up in a family, in a community that really knew nothing, probably much like, you know, yourself, and like out in the prairies there, like knew nothing about who I was or where I came from. We knew that there was other adopted Indigenous children, and, you know, I had friends and stuff, but we didn't know in the school like why that occurred or why we had been adopted. And so then, you know, when I went off to university, I end up in Regina, and at the time there was what was called the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, which is now the First Nations University of Canada. And when I got there, I mean, I was literally, for the first time in my life, I saw Indigenous like professors, administrators, professionals in a way that I had never seen before. And when I walked in there, people knew who I was. They knew that the children had been stolen. They didn't know me specifically, but they knew the circumstances, and that played a big role in, you know, the fact that I ended up there in kind of starting me on that path to reconnect to who I was and where I came from. And so I would, you know, so 1991 was about when the search started.
I can't even, like, I'm getting goosebumps because I'm now, as you're telling the story, I'm actually visualizing going into a place there. You're like, oh my God, I found my people. I found my people. Where have you been all my life? And knowing that they knew more about your story than you did, I can't even imagine how that must have felt when you actually, how did you actually unravel that piece? Did somebody pull you aside?
You know, there was students who were my age and students who were older, and just, you know, the professors, and, you know, a couple come to mind. You know, Tom Dory, who was a lawyer, Bill Sikanak, who's passed away since, and just it was like just like coming home to what I didn't know, like a home that I didn't know was there, and a community that I didn't know was there. And it was the start of me being able to also feel good about who I was as an Indigenous person, right? Because we'd been taught, so many people had been taught that, you know, that we were the stereotypes, the negative stereotypes, that was sort of our own doing, not understanding and recognizing the historical history and trauma that caused that. Like, imagine, you know, generations of people who have had their children stolen, and how, like, entire communities, and how you cope with that, and those sorts of things. And so, you know, when I think about it, I think about, like, my grandmother was taken by the police. My mother ended up also being removed, and then I get taken out of the home by police. I have, you know, a nephew out here in Ontario. I have, when I think about it, there's 4 generations in my family who have not grown up within what most people, you know as a family unit. And it's been because of sort of the government policies of taking children out. And so when I speak about the intergenerational trauma, there's that intergenerational harm that comes from those experiences that we've never made right yet. We have more kids in care right now in Canada. We have, I think, almost 50% of kids in care are Indigenous nationally, and yet we're only 7% of the population, like of the youth population. In Manitoba, I think almost 90% of kids in care are Indigenous. So we still have, and I think that is occurring because of the intergenerational harm that has occurred about stealing the previous generations.
It just breaks my heart, hearing the stories and the tragedies and just knowing how, there's only so much period of time that you have with your kids
Yeah.
before they leave home and start their own lives. And, it, as a parent myself, I'm just like, like you can see the tears in my eyes. Like literally, it's so tragic. Um, I have to ask you, as you were finding your birth mom, how did you go about finding your birth mom? Was she the first person that you said, okay, I mean, she was able to tell you that you had other siblings because, of course, 14 months old, you don't really have any memory of anybody else. But how did you go about finding your birth mom?
Yeah, so I think, initially I started writing, and I don't have it out here, but I have a folder about this thick of letters that I've written to different government agencies, departments over like 25 years. And I didn't know exactly like how to go about it in the beginning or what I could ask. And again, there's been lots of like policy changes as well, like through government, as well in relation to Indigenous peoples during the last 25, 30 years. And so initially, if I look back at the first letter, I think I wrote to the government trying to find out if they could give me any health information, because I was, saying I was concerned about my health. And so I didn't know what I could ask. And so that was kind of the first letter that I wrote, asking if they, could tell me anything about my health. And then, and what happened actually was a social worker wrote a letter back and provided me a whole bunch of non-identifying family information that I was not at all prepared to hear. And so I got a letter back that said, my birth mom was 15 when she had me. I was taken at 14 months old. And then it proceeded to list in 1975, she had a son and his name was blah, blah, blah. He was apprehended on this date. In 1977, she had another child and they were apprehended. And so it listed all of these siblings. And so here I was, 19 years old, realizing that my youngest siblings were the youngest under 10 still, and recognizing that I thought they were in care, like in custody. And what was I going to do about that? Like, how was I 19? I couldn't even have my own life together, but supposed to like go around and collect these siblings and bring the family back together. And so I struggled. Like I was emotionally with just everything that was going on and trying to understand that. And I wasn't in a good place myself for a year or so after that, trying to sort of navigate that space.
So your family that you were in the care of, were they the first, of course, your mom and dad, your only mom and dad and family unit that you had. Did you reach out to them? And how did they receive that information? Did they have any knowledge?
Yeah, and I think uh, my family that I grew up with, I had lots of opportunity. Going to university was not an option for me. It was, and was an intervention that was, has definitely very much positively impacted me. And I grew up in a home with a lot of opportunity. Unfortunately, reconnecting with my birth family was not something that they were able to support. And it's, and I've talked to others, some have, some haven't, for multiple reasons, that it doesn't, it's not, it just is what it is. And I think it was hard on everybody. So so mostly I was navigating it with myself, with my research skills that we're developing, and people that I met along the way. What I found out is that you could, I wanted a copy of my adoption order, because I heard that your adoption order has a birth name and then the name change on it. And so I bought one from the government, because you can't get those for free. And so I had to pay for it. And I got a copy of it, and it said my last name was Campbell. And I knew I'd been born in Regina. I was already living in Regina. And so I went to the public school archives to look through yearbooks to see if I could find people who looked like me. And that was like really one of the starts. Is I just started looking through yearbooks, looking for Campbells who went to schools in, there's some very specific sort of poor neighborhoods where a lot of Indigenous is a high Indigenous population. And so I started there, and just ran into some people along the way who knew somebody, and we tracked down the right people. And I found, I found somebody who I thought was my birth mom. And then back when we had phone books, then I went to the library, public library, right, to get the big phone books to look up somebody with people with that name in Saskatoon, because that's where I thought that she was living at the time. And wrote down a list of phone numbers, and went home and proceeded to start making phone calls. And I wasn't able to get a hold of a Brenda Campbell, which is my mom's name, but I also noticed that there was a Ricky Campbell living in the same apartment building. And so I finally got a hold of Ricky. It was Richard Campbell, and he answered the phone, and I was, I'm trying to explain myself. I'm like, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to really get a hold of Brenda Campbell. I don't know if you know who that is, but I know she's in the same building as you, and I'm just wondering if you know her. And he was just so polite. And he was just like, who's calling, please? And can I ask who's calling? And I'm like, oh, I just really don't want to say, like, do you know her? Do you think you could get her to come to the phone, because I can't get a hold of her? And who does that? Like, who would let some other random person into their apartment anyways? But eventually he said, I'll go see if she's home. And so she came onto the phone in his apartment, and I asked her, I probably really only need to ask her 2 questions, but I must ask her like about 12, to questions that I knew to be the truth, and to find out who she was and who I might be in relation to her. And so eventually I just said, well, I'm your daughter. And she just literally, I could just hear, like, she pulled the phone away, and she's like, Ricky, it's Lorianne, because that was my birth name. She goes, and then I always knew you'd be the first one to come back and find us. And so she started talking, and I think about a week later, I managed to get up to Saskatoon and meet her in person. But
wow. Like, I can't even imagine how exciting that was for her, going, somebody's found, one of my kids has found their way back to me. So what was that first meeting like, meeting your mom?
Right. So it was hard, right? Because by then, literally, actually, there's a time gap there. There's about 5 or 6 years that had gone by from that first letter, in how long it took me, because I would find out a little piece of something, and then I'd kind of have to process it, right? Because but also, by that time, I had finished my first degree, which was in Indigenous Studies. I had a really good understanding of what had happened in Canada in relation to Indigenous peoples, and about that intergenerational trauma, and about how harmed our people were, and how many of them were still, suffering the consequences of that, and struggling. And so I wasn't, my mom at the time, also on the phone, had given me the names of a couple aunties that lived in Regina. And so it was actually them that I met first. And they were closer to my age, and they remembered me because they were young, just a few years older than me when I was in the home. And they kind of also helped prepare me to meet my mom, and just, were realistic about her situation. And I'm not sharing anything that my mom hasn't supported me in sharing in numerous different ways. But life has been hard. I mean, imagine, she lost child after child, and some may say, well, she shouldn't have had 6 or 7 children. There were 7 of us born, one's deceased. But at the same time, when you keep getting child after child stolen, you are hopeful that at some point you can keep a child and parent them. And and then growing up as an urban Indigenous, very, very Indigenous looking young woman in an urban setting, there weren't a lot of options at that time. And she was, predators sought her out, as they did many of the young girls. And when I did first go meet her, she had got nervous, and so I ended up actually meeting her at the hospital, because she's is a substance abuser still at times. And so you can just imagine also the stress of that on her end. But most heartbreakingly, and other than that, I just stared, because for the first time in my life, I saw literally, like, I remember staring at her hands, her eyes, her ears, because I just never seen that before. Those things that we take for granted, like where you say, I don't know, maybe you say to your own kids, like, oh, you got, your father is this, or, your aunties is like, you those sorts of things. Like, I didn't realize how significant those were until I, saw things like that reflected for the first time. But one of the things my mom had told me sort of first off wasn't even that she was worried that I'd be angry with her because of her circumstances or anything like that, but that she was worried that I might be angry because she made me Indigenous. And that's, out of all the things, that's probably the thing that, sort of breaks my heart the most, and really, I think really speaks loud and clear to, to all Canadians about how much harm we've caused Indigenous peoples, that a parent would be worried that their child will hate them for making them, biologically who they are, because there's that much, racism that still exists, across Turtle Island for us. So, but yeah, it's she's still alive, still back in Regina, and yeah. But of course, then she was able to tell me, obviously, like you mentioned, the other siblings, and had ideas even of where some of them were, but not all. Yeah.
Not all of them. So you found 6, and there was.
But it took me a long time, right? Because there was, in particular, two siblings that I really struggled to find. One is the second youngest, who I thought was deceased, because I had talked to a foster parent that had fostered him, but they wouldn't let me see him, and he had some very specific health issues, and I was told that he wasn't going to live into adulthood, but he did. And so I have some guilt too, because I kind of ceased that search after a number of years, but came back to it because I was trying to find death certificate and things like that, and I couldn't. And so it was always very troubling for me that I couldn't find that, because as the years gone by and I worked, I'm an academic, I'm a scholar now, I'm a pretty good researcher. And so, as my skill set increased, so did my, ability to kind of track people down. But there was one sibling that I really, really struggled to find, and that's my brother, that's closest in age to me. So he's 3 years younger than me. And by this time, I knew that he had been adopted twice. I knew that he had moved provinces. And I knew that he was, that now, at the time then, an almost 40-year-old Indigenous man who we had no idea who he was or where he was from. And we know how that goes for, our Indigenous men in Canada. And so eventually you can also see as our ability to do things changes. So social media is like on the rise, right? As we leave the 90s and head into 2000, 2020. And so I started using that platform as well. And so literally I wrote a page, a poster, and said I was looking for this sibling. I gave a few details, and I wrote down the birth year wrong accidentally, but I knew it as soon as I posted it. But once I posted it, it went viral, and there was just no changing it. And I think, I can't remember now, but it was 6 years ago anyways that we first got in contact, or he found me, but somebody who had been a caregiver of his and who also raised my niece out here in Ontario saw it. But I also had support by then by CBC Indigenous. Connie Walker did stories for me. And this person sent me an email and said, I think I know who your brother is. I think I parented him for a while. And so we kind of went back and forth in an exchange. And then he connected me with my brother, and we kind of went over a few more details, and it was pretty clear. My brother out here, and he was adopted. So what happened with the system was he was adopted. They changed his name, his first and last name, and then the adoption broke down. He went back into care under that new name, and then he was adopted again and had another name change in another province. And so it was really difficult, because now then you're dealing with child protection is provincial, and so you're dealing with different provinces and trying to find that information, and which I now have, and he has all of it, his birth, adoption orders, and all of those things, and the name changes, and he always had this like idea in his mind that he thought his first name was different, but he couldn't quite place it. But he also always knew of me. And I think because he had lived in the home until he was 4, and before he was taken, and he always knew he had an older sister. And so he didn't know about the younger ones, but in his mind, he always had this older sister that he, wanted to find or was waiting to find him. But by then he was in Ontario, and he just thought, like, how will I ever do that? Which is really when I ran that on social media, I got hundreds of messages on Facebook, not people necessarily who thought they were my brother, but others like us who were like, can you help me? How do I find my family? I think I'm from this province. Can you help me do that? And and that was also really hard. I wasn't quite prepared for that and the amount of devastation that the 60s Scoop had caused.
Unbelievable story, Lori. Thank you so much for your authenticity. I can't even imagine. I know that every time you tell your story, it helps other people, but it's always, it's always very real, and it takes you back to that moment. So thank you so much for doing that, because I can't imagine that it's still even easy for you to talk about it to this day, because it's still ongoing. You still have siblings, and you can't capture that time back. Do you have you actually, are you keeping in touch now with your siblings? Is that, or your mom, is that an option?
I keep in touch with my mom on a regular basis. I'm the only one who knows and who's physically been in spaces with all of my siblings. There's probably 3 of them that I'm in fairly regular contact with, and 2 others that I'm not in regular contact with, for various reasons, right? I know, sometimes people like to think, oh, this is a happy sort of ending story, but I take you back to where I kind of started. Not all homes were the same as others, where children went, and so there was a lot of struggles and issues, and so there's a lot, so I feel like a little bit lucky and fortunate, which is weird, right? What kid should feel lucky or fortunate that they went to a home where they weren't mistreated and things like that, and not to say that necessarily all my siblings were, because they weren't, but we all deal with the struggles of the loss differently, and it happened at different stages of our life. And again, I walked into the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College when I was 19 years old, and one of the things my brother out here had asked me early on was, do you think it impacted you in a different way being able to find out who you were earlier? And nobody had asked me that before, but yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, I've had over 25, almost 30 years now to kind of process all of this. My brother out here, he's only had 6, and I've only been out here for 4. We didn't physically meet until 4 years ago in Ontario, and and then we have all that space of what occurred in between in our lives and the people we interacted with that were either positive or not. So
I always think that your story is like, a spool, and you just pull it out, and it's like everything that you do kind of leads you to this moment. I know that in your bio, you're very involved in politics, and you were a federal candidate in 2019. Do you think that it's your research and your passion for, bringing this awareness and your experiences, that sort of channeled you to like take a bigger stand and a voice? Is that how you ventured into politics? Was that your open door, or how did that happen? That, from all the research that you've done and your experiences, what was that push to actually get you to step into that political platform?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, fundamentally, I think
Okay.
So I think fundamentally, first of all, that if we want to talk about sort of elected positions, I think, Indigenous peoples need to be in all conversations about all issues that affect all people across Canada. But I can't say that I felt like I had this burning desire to enter into what I call mainstream politics. And what literally, I mean, I was just doing my thing and the kind of work that I do. And it was the federal party that had reached out to me, and I got a phone call one night and saying, hey, we're wondering. And I kind of like wanted to say no, because I kind of saw that, I just kind of thought that was like a really, I say horrible, like a challenging space to be in, right? And a lot of like really negative things can happen. But I told them that I would, I think about it, because it was a very big ask. It was like a big thing. And so I thought I deserved due consideration before I felt like if I had a good reason to say no. And so again, I went back to my people, my friends. I came back to Saskatchewan. I asked people who knew me if they thought that this is a space that I should get into. And of course, one of the people I called was my auntie, who's Maria Campbell, and is back in Saskatchewan, and certainly well known and well respected back in the prairies, but nationally and internationally. And I had remembered also this conversation. So I kind of blame it on her, because literally like 25 years ago, when I had first met her, early on, we were out for lunch one day, and she was talking to me about my history and our people, like she was, does, and teaching me. And we were just having lunch, and I was in my early 20s, and I was still a little, little twerp, still kind of a little cocky and flippant and stuff. And at one point she says to me, she says, my girl, she says, when are you going to get into politics? And I'm like, why would I do that? I'm like, and I kind of just said it like that, right? And just real flippant. And she like just kind of looked at me and got quiet and sipped some more tea. And I was like, and I knew right away, right? I knew I'd said something probably not okay, but I didn't really understand at the time, right? And so I just kind of like, sat there eating and whatever. And then she just kind of said, she said, to be Indigenous is to be political. And I never really consciously invested a lot of thought into what the meaning of that was at the time, but it was something that always stuck with me. And so when I got the call about asking if I'd run, I kind of also thought about that. And I thought about also the kind of work that I do, the kind of skill set that I have, how I can have impact in the best places. We all have places where we can have impact. And we need some people to be in post-secondaries. We need some people to be in the K-12 system. We need some people to be our child care givers. We need people in elected leadership. We need everybody, right? And everybody, there's opportunities for impact. Everybody can have impact. And my skill set, and one of the ways I seemed able to do it was to sort of navigate those spaces. And so I also recognized, like what my auntie had meant by that, because in Canada in particular, as Aboriginal peoples, of Turtle Island, and because of the ongoing issues that are in contemporary times that, are sort of compacted and compounded from previous things that have occurred in previous governments. To be Indigenous is to be political, walking into space. To have the honor of winning this award and being one of very few Indigenous women nominees, and one of I think 2 or 3 recipients in different categories, is also political, in that we have, at the time when the rest of Canada was able to move ahead and even women were able to vote, we still were not allowed to vote. We were not allowed into those spaces. We weren't allowed to acquire land. We still can't own homes on reserves. And so we can live in communities. We can't access equity to buy other things because we still can't have home ownership on reserves. And so even to let my name stand and to have this award, it becomes a political act, and it becomes an opportunity for hopefully other Indigenous young women, young people, to see that we as Indigenous people can be and deserve to be and have the ability to be in all spaces. And we need to be in all spaces where all people are.
Mm. Beautifully said, Lori. I really do believe that we do have a lot of opportunity right now. And I'm very excited for the next year and sort of the progression that we've been moving towards. And I have to share that, Women of Inspiration Awards was created in 2015. That was the very first award. There was one award, and that was for my family law lawyer, one woman. Mm-hmm. And then we had 10 categories, and then we had 12 categories, and then we had more categories. And really, we grew our categories based on the nominations that came in. But at a very, very early point, I think it was our second or third year, because we're still sort of finding out we're still growing the program, but it was a very intentional and purposeful, okay, so let's look at those categories, right? Who do we want to represent the voices of? And from the very onset, we were very much a diverse, inclusive culture from the very beginning in 2014 when I launched. But the awards and really calling out and being able to recognize women at every stage and from across every industry and race was really important. So that's where we thought we could do our part and really bring to light Indigenous leadership. And I have to say that I really hope that we can champion for more Indigenous leaders to be recognized. I really am excited about that opportunity where leaders like yourself are in that position now, and as award recipients, that we can share your stories, share your background, your work, and then invite others to sort of step into being recognized for their contribution and have equal opportunity. I think it's really great, and I think that's where we're going for 2021. So I really am thankful for this conversation, and I know that the listeners are, I have lots of people that go for their walks and their drives to work. Maybe that's just now on their walks with everybody working from home. But this is such a time for change. And I think that your voice is so incredibly important. And I'm just excited for how the ripple is going to start rippling out further. I know that as we talked in the green room before, I want to just, a couple more points I want to ask you about is you talked about your auntie. And she's an elder, and she has a pretty remarkable story. Maybe you can just touch on your positive female role models in your world mm-hmm. that have sort of championed for you along the way and gave you the support. Maybe you can touch on those women in your world that helped you.
Yeah, and so I mean, I have what I call sort of like my two sort of leading aunties in this world, and one was in my adoptive family. She was my father's sister, and a neighbor on a neighboring farm. And I was lucky because she had 4 sons who were quite a lot older than me, and so I was the first girl sort of around. And I spent a lot of time with her, and she was the one person in my family who made a point of talking to me about being Indigenous. And, had offered to support me in finding my family and recognizing the importance of that. And she was super significant for me. She's since passed a number of years ago. And then when I found my birth family and found out early on, because my mom told me that, that Maria Campbell was a relative, and I connected with her. She has just, she's so kind and so generous and been through and seen so much. She's in her 80s now, and always takes time, and not just for me, but for and not just for family, but others, Indigenous people to share, to ensure that we know that we're loved, that we were missed, that to ensure that we're included, and to take time to teach us. And she's the kind of auntie that she's so impressive. I never want to do anything that would make her think poorly of me, and so I kind of use that in my mind all the time. I'm like, if this gets back to my auntie, how is she going to respond? And So I have these two aunties, and early on, my auntie Maria, of course, she wrote the book Half Breed, which is a very prominent book and a kind of a book I think every Canadian should read. And I had got a copy of the book and she signed it, and I have a picture where I'd given it to my other auntie. And so I have a picture of my other auntie who had read the book, and I'd given it to her at Christmas. And so it's kind of like the meeting of my two aunties where they were kind of sort of connecting on a level that, they'd both always been there. They didn't know of each other, and I didn't necessarily know of both of them at the same time. But so those two people very much in particular, and then I've always been curious, and I've always just asked people. So I kind of sometimes think I'm kind of one of those people where I kind of follow. I see somebody that I think is doing amazing work or has a skill set that I want to learn how they're doing that, or how they got that job, or how they're speaking like that, or any of those things. And I kind of I'm not in a bad way. I'll kind of maybe follow them around a bit, and kind of go to what they're speaking at, and keep kind of trying to talk to them, and eventually, for whatever reason, we end up forming relationships, and many of them have taken on these mentorship roles in my life, and still to this day, I mean, where I can just reach out and to people and look for support. And because I've had that opportunity is probably one of the reasons, and that experience and been taught by so many is probably also one of the reasons why I see it as a big, a very important responsibility to also continue that, right? Not everybody has had that, but anybody who comes into contact with me can have that. And so I want to kind of pass that on. And again, when I think about, people like my auntie and all the suffering that they've gone through in their lives, as far as watching, the children being taken and everything like that, I think, when I think my life's bad, I'm like, you know what? They were strong and resilient and persevered, and it's now my turn to be strong and resilient and to persevere, so that we can move the bar forward, and raise the bar like this, right? And be in these spaces together and have leaders talking, Indigenous leaders talking with non-Indigenous leaders, and I think great things can come from finally being able to be in the same spaces together to have those conversations.
Well said. And it does, mentorship is actually a very big piece of the Women of Inspiration Awards. Of course, we always look as leaders in the leadership responsibility is to share the knowledge. So that is a big piece. We look forward to, our 2021 Mentor Her mentorship program. So all our alumni, our 2020 leaders are part of that. So that's fantastic. The lucky woman that gets to be mentored with you, Lori, is certainly going to flourish and really, have a lot of support there because of your care. And, so I'm just really grateful to have you on the show today to share your background, your incredible story, and why you do what you do. And, I just want to say thank you again, because I know that it's hard to share these pieces, but if we don't share them, then it doesn't benefit anybody. And I really love how this is going to really open the door for a much larger conversation. I'd also like to sort of touch on, your biggest lessons in COVID. We're coming out of COVID right now, and, we're still not out of COVID. I mean, we're in December, and it's almost been a full year in March. And, who could have thought? So, what kind of were your biggest lessons through the pandemic?
Yeah, so I mean, the pandemic's been tough on everybody, but I would also say it's we're not necessarily all in the same boat, because our starting position wasn't all the same, right? And so when I think about things in Indigenous communities in particular, and other marginalized groups and poorer neighborhoods, and some of the health disparities that already exist in access, we knew right away that it was going to exponentially cause harm in our communities, and certainly that's what the data is now showing. And so I think it's important to really, for all of us to, really acknowledge, how it's hit some of us differently, and we're all suffering losses, but in different ways and different levels, and to remind us to be, compassionate to one another, I think is extremely important. I've done a lot of, just reaching out, and maybe that comes a little bit with the compassion side or not, but not all of us have, even have family units that we're just not able to like go visit, right? Like I don't particularly have a family home or Christmas or whatever, like within my adoptive family or my birth family that I necessarily would be going to. So that's familiar to me, but there's lots of people like that. And so we can still reach out, like I think people should absolutely over the holidays be dropping, and I do this, I like go through my address book regularly and just start dropping a couple texts every day to people, how you doing? Because we also don't know, like I don't know, exactly. I see you here and you're doing great work, but when we're off screen and when you're on your own, I don't know what's going on. And, you might just say back, everything's good, it's great. And I'll, say something to the next person, but that next person might say like, yeah, it's a really tough time right now. And, and to kind of just drop some kind words and be compassionate, I think, and caring to one another, I think is something that I've really, really thought about. And the other thing, I just hope people, stay safe and stay healthy, and the sooner we're over this, the sooner we all get to see our families. And I haven't been home for almost a year now because it's not a good idea to come from Ontario to Saskatchewan, when I don't need to, in times like this. So I just tell people to stay safe, stay healthy, and stay connected.
Beautiful. And what about as we embark on this new year? I don't know if you're one of these people that has like a word of the year. Have you given any thought to what that might be? I might be putting you a little bit on the spot, but what, if you could sort of sum up one word for what you want your 2020 to be, what would that be?
I think there's just been a lot of transformation, and a lot of transformation and how we're seeing each other, how we're reimagining things, and how we connect with one another, what we value and maybe what we thought we valued.
Very cool. Well, I think that's a true, very timely word, transformation, about evolving to the next level and how we can be better people and teach more. But I just want to say thank you so much, Lori. If there's any last words of wisdom that you'd love to share with any leaders that, let's just say, always wanted to take action on something, what words of advice would you give those leaders about something that seems great, big, hairy, and audacious, and there's no blueprint for that they can tackle? What words of advice would you give them to go ahead and jump in?
I always remind myself of like just always putting one foot in front of the other. Not every day is going to be our best day, but as long as we do our best every day, we can have and we will have impact. And we have a teaching too that also tells us that we don't necessarily need to know or hear what the impact is, but we still have a responsibility to keep, raising that bar. It could be somebody that, saw this that I may never know, that maybe it's had a tremendous impact on. It's only my ego that kind of tells me that, oh, I'd like to know that. But, on a soul and a spirit level, if there's been some positive impact for somebody else, I'm just happy and grateful to, be the recipient of this award, to have this opportunity with you to potentially have impact in that way and in somebody else's life for them.
Oh, we will have the impact. That is a given, because it's all, the horse is out of the gate, Lori. I think it's already out of the gate. We've got lots planned. So listeners, they want to get a hold of you, they want to learn more about the work that you're doing, follow you, how can they get a hold of you other than, you know, our website that has information there? But if they want to get in direct contact with you, how can they do that?
So they can track me down on LinkedIn is a great way to get a hold of me. And I don't know how we share that information. It's somewhere here. And
I will put it in the bio. LinkedIn is the best. It's Lori Campbell, and just a LinkedIn search. And perhaps maybe if they can track it, if they can say, hey, I heard the Woman of Inspiration podcast, then you'll know, okay, that was a call out. I'm taking action on it, because I don't know about you, but I get a million requests. So if you are reaching out to Lori on LinkedIn, just say, hey, I heard your podcast on the Woman of Inspiration podcast. I'd love to connect. And that might be a really great, hey, I'm going to accept that one and have that conversation. So
if you're just looking to do some learning, which I also really think is important, people will follow me on my Twitter, and there'll even be things where I'll say, if you're here to learn, check this out, read this. And it's also a great way to learn a little bit more about some of these issues and to, you know, fill in those educational gaps that we all missed out on.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Lori. Again, everyone, this was the Woman of Inspiration podcast. My name is Monica Kretschmer, and this was an extraordinary interview with 2020 Woman of Inspiration Indigenous leader, Lori Campbell. And I look forward to some great work. My mind is active with all of the initiatives that we can start to kind of put into place from this point. So thank you everyone for joining. You know, if you loved this podcast, please do your part and support her by sharing the podcast with your network. And let's move those mountains. Thank you very much, Lori. Have a great day.
Thank you.